Mobile Suit Gundam Battle Operation 2. A game that I was obsessed with for a few years, and one of many stepping stones to my channel being where it is today. My first 100 subscribers came from doing GBO2 videos, particularly a few tutorial shorts I tried doing. But for those not in the know, it's a free-to-play, PvP-focused multiplayer game based on the Mobile Suit Gundam anime franchise, with a gacha mechanic to acquire new mobile suits to play as. It was always a love-it-or-hate-it game, with mechanics that could be divisive. Heavy focus on staggering enemies with a slower, weightier movement system. But I found it compelling, especially since so many mech games fall into one of two extremes. The Western-style mech games like MechWarrior, which are often quite good and do generally remember to include a sense of weight, but are generally not as much to my tastes, or many Japanese mech games that feel a bit too arcadey and like the fact that you're controlling a giant war machine has no impact on gameplay, and the game would play exactly the same if you were just playing as a person. But GBO2 hit about the balance I'd want. The mechs feel agile as they would be in the series they're from, but they also feel weighty, especially when using boost movement, and can take a fair bit of punishment. And space combat, while slower than in actual Gundam series, does feel at least like proper space combat with inertia and an emphasis on moving in 3 dimensions. It was also a bit unpopular because it was tricky, but I liked it. So given the lack of good competition, sadly this is not the PS2 era with its abundance of Gundam games, I got into GBO2 a few days after it came out in the West, and got pretty hooked for several years. And keep in mind, I'm not normally a huge PvP guy, but this game was just perfect for me. But today I want to do maybe my last GBO2 video, and focus on one particular year of the game. What I consider to be its best year, or probably really more like its best 6 to 9 months. The start was rough, but once this golden year got going, well, it's where I really fell in love with GBO2. First, a little backstory of the game before the Golden Age. Keep in mind I was at lower ranks for most of this, so there may be some inaccuracies because this is mostly coming from my own memory of events. The early era of the game was notable for being focused almost entirely on the 1-year war. Combined with a general focus on more grunt suits, a lot more of suits at the time had interchangeable main weapons, though mostly they fit into 3 main types. Machine guns fired fast and reloaded fast, having the best DPS but low burst damage, and being limited to staggering enemies through repeated shots. Bazookas were the opposite, dealing high single shot damage, instantly staggering targets, and of course having splash damage, but their extremely long delay between shots and even longer reload times meant they had a lot of downtime that could limit their contribution in team fights or be exploited by a skilled player. And beam rifles were somewhere in the middle. Most of them followed a pattern where they could do damage efficiently with faster tap shots, or go for a stagger with a charge shot, but they used an overheat system that made them generally trickier to use, plus their charge shot could be interrupted, making them harder to use for the stagger than a bazooka is. And these main weapons were much more important in the early era of GBO2 because very few suits had a suite of good weapons. Most had a fairly standard primary weapon, usually fitting squarely into the 3 main types mentioned above, along with a low-spec sub-weapon, maybe 2 if they were lucky. Even having a single decent sub-weapon was very notable in this era. While some suits did break from this and come better equipped, they tended to be glass cannons or otherwise tricky to handle. Stuff like the Comfer, the Pale Riders, or the Gundam Alex. All of which were some of my favorites. They're harder to use, sure, but immensely rewarding if used right. The dominant tactic for a while, though, was the stagger into melee combo. Hit something with a bazooka, then dash into melee and knock down for high damage. The game does have a counter system, so meleeing someone from the front who isn't staggered was a gamble unless you knew their thrusters had overheated. So staggering the enemy and then going in for melee was easy, did a lot of damage, and could be annoying to fight against. but crucially, it wasn't overpowered. The long cycle time between shots and even longer reloads, combined with the weak secondaries of the time, meant that missing a shot or having an enemy emergency evade out of the follow-up could leave you with a lot of downtime, either making it harder to back up your allies or being easily exploited by a better player. Unfortunately though, this did get a bit worse when we got into the Zeta Gundam era. This is where beam rifles that could stagger and basically just functioned like bazookas without splash damage got far more prevalent, much to the detriment of the game in my opinion. The old standard charging beam rifles were my personal favorite weapon type, giving you a variety of options and making you play smarter, not to mention having a large amount of variation. The game would have been great in the Zeta era with them being pushed more heavily, but instead we got an era with almost all beam rifles being functionally basically identical to bazookas and not all that different from each other. And fuck, I like Zeta Gundam's design for their elegance. Simple mobile suits with only a couple features and a focus on long-range beam rifle combat in the series, but instead in this game the Zeta era was dominated by stagger weapons and melee attacks. And this was all made worse because this is where we started to see some suits go above and beyond with little trade-off. The Gundam Mark II was quite dominant for a while with extremely strong melee and solid sub-weapons, while the Garibaldi Beta was popular for its strong and simple back melee and 2 stagger options. They still had their weaknesses, but they weren't as badly impacted by the weaknesses of bazooka weapons as older mobile suits were. Fortunately, this wouldn't last though, as there was a change coming that would sweep away the old meta and give me my personal favorite era of the game. Yes, finally we're going to talk about the thing we're here for. An exact start to GBO2's Golden Age is a little difficult to place, because the meta that would contain the Golden Age didn't really start out great. While the new era started with the introduction of the Double Zeta Gundam and Cubile, along with the introduction of 650-point matches, the Double Zeta was really undertuned at launch. It's possibly the most buffed suit in the game, since it gained both its shoulder beam cannons and its mobile armor mode only in later updates. 2 separate ones because it needed 2 major buffs to be good. The Cubile, meanwhile, was firmly overtuned when it released, dominating the meta, and then they added the Dovenwolf, with its very powerful shooting weapons and being very difficult to stagger. But while the Cubile and Dovenwolf were overtuned at first, I do think they ultimately were for the best for the game, because they created a clean slate for the meta going forward. By dominating 650 and to a lesser extent 600 with the Dovenwolf so completely, they ensured that none of the dominant suits from lower cost metas could define the new higher cost metas. Especially stuff like the Gundam Mark II that had gotten pretty tiresome by this point. GBO2 already has a few of these sort of breakpoints where there's enough new mobile suits that are strong enough that you just don't see many lower cost suits brought in. A similar phenomenon around 400 points, which fittingly was in the 1 Year War only days, about where you switched over from grunt suits to limited production and ace suits. The Gundam itself was at 400 points, and the most prominent Gelgoog variants ranged from 350 to 450. But I think these kinds of breakpoints can be very good for the game since they help give certain cost brackets their own unique flavor. But this would set the stage for the development of what I will call the shooting meta, starting with the Cubile and its funnels, then backed up with the Dovenwolf being just generally terrifying at long range but rather weak up close. The meta was defined by suits with a wide variety of ranged weapons, and this got further reinforced with the XS Gundam and the FAZZ. Combat became a lot more focused around mid to long range shooting battles with heavy use of cover. And this was also when we started seeing more usable remote weapons. This all meant that trying to just charge over open ground or space suddenly became a lot more dangerous, and battles were won and lost by positioning and coordinating and prioritizing fire. And this ultimately felt, well, very Gundam. I generally associate mobile suit combat in most Gundam series more with shooting than with melee, so it was nice to have the game reflect that a bit more. Not to mention, it felt better balanced. Shooting was the dominant tactic, but getting in close remained viable as a high-risk, high-reward tactic, because critically, even the strong suits had their weaknesses. The Cubile was powerful and had some overtuned defensive skills before it was nerfed, sure, but it was quickly outclassed in its weapon selection, limited to only a fairly basic staggering beam gun and its various funnel modes, and if one of its funnel volleys was active, it couldn't use the other or the follow mode for its funnels. And many of the other prominent shooting suits were cripplingly weak in close combat if you could close in, although the Dovenwolf and FAZZ resisted conventional instant stagger options and had to be staggered through sustained hits, which just adjusted which suits could excel. I think a lot of my favorite things about this era of GBO2 can be summed up by two of my favorite mobile suits from this era, the Tristan and the Todesritter. The Tristan is an unassuming suit, and I think most players would assume it's awful. Charging beam rifle, a secondary machine gun, and a low-power Sturmfaust for the only instant stagger that didn't require a charge. None of these are popular things, and it also had a very high turning rate that made it difficult to handle on PS4. And yet I was able to make it sing, as were the rare few other players I saw using it. Its beam rifle was solid at all ranges, taking pot shots at long range, or as an opener at close range. The Sturmfaust could be nearly as good as a full bazooka if you were already inclined to use such weapons sparingly as I am, and the arm machine gun was a fantastic all-around tool. Fantastic mid-range DPS and stagger accumulation that can either be used to chase the beam rifle, which itself has surprisingly great stagger accumulation but cannot capitalize on it on its own, to chase a stagger and pile on damage if it's too risky to close into melee, or just as a good mid-range weapon with high performance. It's a great suit for how I like to fight, outplaying the opponent with a variety of options rather than overpowering them with brute force. But if I did need to overpower someone, well, that's what the Todesritter is for. The final form of my beloved Pale Rider line, many of which were frequent choices of mine at lower costs. While the Tristan is elegant with a mid-sized selection of weapons that you have to use carefully, the Todesritter is a walking arsenal of powerful but tricky to use weapons, all built around a very good beam rifle. Two separate remote weapons that can be fired in sequence, chest Vulcans and shoulder beam guns for rapid fire damage, and shield guns that provide high damage and stagger but have to be used sparingly. And the beam rifle's one of the best ones in the game, at least at the time, with rapid fire shots that could pile on damage and easily accumulate stagger, and a charge shot that still only consumes a single shot, not to mention the relatively quick reload. To me, the Todesritter is everything I'd want, an array of tricky weapons with which I can control the battlefield. Its biggest weakness was probably the careful weapon management needed to make it work, since many of its weapons would overheat very quickly, but I had already trained on similar suits. But there were so many other great mobile suits during this era as well, and the variety was one of its strengths. The Bawu brought a versatile shooting-focused raid suit with a powerful missile barrage that could brutalize downed targets. The Hama Hama was a mid-range support option that excelled at supporting allies with high damage, multiple stagger options, and a surprisingly good beam saber that, while still inferior to focusing on shooting, especially for a support suit, made it dangerous even against enemies that got close. The Dija SCR was a powerful melee suit with two stagger weapons and excellent boost ability, but at the cost of not having emergency evasion. The Zekurines Type 3 was a big, tanky unit with a powerful machine gun, perfect for tipping the scales in a shooting-focused team fight, with a secondary bazooka to help fend off enemies in close and stagger opponents. The Gilgug Vertex, a late addition in the era, quickly became one of my favorite raid class suits, with a unique automatic heat-based beam machine gun that was incredibly powerful if you used it right, generally solid mid-range damage output, and excellent melee power that was balanced by its melee being harder to set up. And those are just some of my favorites. What made this era great was the variety of suits that were prominent. No feature beyond the very broad shoots good was particularly necessary, and no specific setup was pushed too hard, and every suit had its drawbacks. There were no mobile suits that did it all, and that is good, interesting game design. And also worth mentioning to illustrate why I liked it were the suits that didn't dominate. This was when early heavy attacker mobile suits showed up, and they were underwhelming, with the early ones having long charge times that precluded any kind of setup, and no real tools to help them land these heavy attacks. So it was ultimately a pretty niche skill that was only useful if you could blindside an enemy with it. Otherwise, they were incredibly predictable, and heavy attack suits were notable for how easily they could be countered. And then there's the O, a suit whose introduction I was dreading. That would be a simple, thoughtless, straightforward stagger and melee suit like a 650 point Gundam Mark II. That everyone would be using it, and that the lovely meta we had at the higher cost would be destroyed. But that didn't happen. In the end, it was a decently strong suit that you certainly had to be wary of and treat with respect, but its limited range and large size were major issues in an era of longer range combat and lock-on remote weapons. Plus, by the time it was added, the Excess and Todesritter were already in the game to secure the shooting meta. And while the meta was certainly the most important thing, there are other great parts to this era of the game too. For one, this was the era when I really got addicted to mix-up, once the 650 meta became good anyway. I think it started as an easy way to farm matches during the Halloween event that year, but then I got addicted and would play it extensively every weekend. Like, okay, I know that mix-up's going to be from this time to this time, so I'm going to just play the game like 2 hours straight, and just play mix-up. Mostly, I like how short and sweet these battles were. Racing to deplete the opposing team's life pool was definitely more satisfying than just who has the most points when time runs out, and it took less time per match. Plus, the fact it had a knockout condition, unlike any other mode, meant that one-sided matches would end quickly and not drag on. For this reason, I genuinely think a mode that always goes to time with no knockout condition is bad in any game. Having a knockout condition makes it feel better for the winners to sweep with little difficulty, rather than reaching a point where their victory is a foregone conclusion and they're just waiting for the game to acknowledge it, and at the same time it spares the losers a drawn-out defeat. Sure, the mode could have been better, maybe a little bit longer per match, and maybe rather than ending the moment the enemy's respawn pool is reduced to 0, I would have preferred something that prevents respawning, with the match actually ending when a team is wiped out, but it is what it is. It was still the best mode in the game. And then, one last great part of this is that this is when simulation battles were added. They're nothing crazy, admittedly, especially not the early ones, but they're a fun side diversion every few months when there's a new set, although I certainly would have liked to have more. I still would have liked a more fleshed out PvE mode, but the game still benefits from having this, and yeah, we did get Code Fairy later on, and it was good, but it had its own problems. But be it the meta or the new modes added during this time, it was my favorite time in GBO2. Unfortunately, it was not to last, as power creep would steadily take its toll. While the shooting meta itself was also power creep, with suits becoming more versatile than they tended to be before, there still tended to be some kind of a drawback to them. But then we started to see suits with full weapon complements, an array of stagger weapons, and no real weaknesses to exploit. The big warning sign of this was definitely the Rigazi, a powerful all-purpose raid-type suit with a staggering primary rifle, staggering secondary hip grenades, and arm grenades that could accumulate stagger. Plus, it was one of the first suits to have heavy attack, but but not be hyper-focused on spamming heavy attack. Raids with a good stagger melee combo were rare, but this could dominate most fights through its excessive stagger power and didn't really have many weaknesses. Of course, the real death blow was the introduction of the new Gundam and the Sazabi. These suits would prove to be everything wrong going into the stagger meta era. Extremely strong, versatile mobile suits with multiple simple stagger options with no downsides. Even though they're quite fun themselves, and were at least confined to 700 points, 700 quickly became a bit of a shit show, and sadly that also applied to Mix-Up too. But just as bad as what they'd started within the meta was the other thing that was distinctive about them. They were 4-star mobile suits. Previously, mobile suits only went up to 3 stars, so 4-star mobile suits were much rarer, ruining the sense that you could eventually get any mobile suit you wanted just by playing the game. Took much longer to be directly buyable with in-game currency, forcing you to rely on gacha pulls, and they even had their drop rates reduced whenever the game would give out free pulls. They were basically made to generate FOMO to get people to spend more money on tokens to get them. And then at some point after I stopped playing, they added 5-star suits because I guess 4 stars were just too generous. Look, I'm sure some hardcore gacha gamers will probably find that this all doesn't sound so bad, but it's the fact that this was a change that annoys me. I used to be proud to play this game and gladly spend money on it because it had earned my goodwill by being a good game and not being too predatory. But after 4-star mobile suits, not only did it feel greedy, but I knew that there would be new mobile suits released in the future, likely ones I loved, that I would never be able to get, like the F91 or the Unicorn. Ultimately, of course, I would leave GBO2. Though I did stick around a bit longer, I don't actually remember when I quit. I think I at least made it to the introduction of the Unicorn and Banshee. And ultimately quitting would be for the best. I had gotten a bit too obsessed and frankly toxic about the game. I made myself miserable, and the game stopped being fun, especially when combined with the meta shifting away from my tastes. I would come back a little with the PC port, play with friends a little. Most of my skills remained, but I would still feel remnants of how I used to feel about the game, the stress that getting too serious about it brought me, and that, combined with the meta continuing to change in ways I didn't like, meant that I never really got into it, and apparently only have about 12 hours on Steam. There are some suits I love that have been added to the game, but ultimately I just couldn't enjoy them as much because more and more suits with multiple easy stagger weapons becoming the norm just wasn't interesting to me. Sadly, power creep generally only goes one way, so there was no fixing the stagger meta once it got rolling. Having multiple strong stunning weapons is just such an advantage that the game can only be centralized around it, and you can't really fix this without making these suits, now quite a few of them, dramatically weaker in other areas. Like how the Digi SCR was fine despite having multiple stagger weapons, because it had a critical weakness of lacking emergency evasion, making it require much more careful piloting. I am a little disappointed that things went this way, but not all that upset. It happens, games change, and I got plenty of fun out of it while it lasted. But I would love to have more Gundam games with more of a sim feel. But now back to you. What are your memories with GBO2? What era of the game is your favorite? I obviously love the shooting meta era, but I really can't blame anyone who prefers the pre-Zeta era either. There's a real joy to the grunts versus grunt feeling of 1 Year War GBO2. Let me know in the comments below. But for now, this is Mikhail, signing off.